Today is not going to be about Ruth, it's going to be about Naomi. And I'm still debating about whether we do Ruth next week or not. But I only have one more lesson to go. So, anyway, we're going to talk about Naomi. And I think that's an important lesson because a lot of times when we study the book of Ruth, Naomi is just kind of there. And there are lessons, I think, for us to learn that are really important from Naomi. One of the things that we see almost immediately, Naomi and her family leave Bethlehem, and they go to Moab to live. The reason for this was a famine was in the land. And we'll talk more about that in just a little bit, but going to Moab was a big thing. Moab had never been really great allies with Israel. In fact, as they traveled to get to the land of promise, Moab had opposed them and done really some horrible things there. So for her to go to Moab with her family was pretty astonishing. But of course, we know that when people are desperate, they'll sometimes do things like that. David, before he became the actual king of Israel, moved his family to Moab in order to keep them safe from Saul. So this is not without precedent at this time. As you read through the story about Naomi, one of the first things that you'll notice is how bitter she is. Something that she says often and of herself. In Ruth 1 and in verse 13, when she's trying to persuade her daughter-in-laws from going with her, she says, "For it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of Jehovah has gone out against me." We see not only there the bitterness, but her understanding that Jehovah is against her. When we go to Ruth, the first chapter, verses 20 and 21, and this is when she has come back to Bethlehem from Moab. It's been 10 years. And the people of the town are amazed. "Is this Naomi?" And she says, "Don't call me Naomi anymore. Call me Mara." Mara means bitter. So she adopts that name for herself. That's an astonishing thing. Usually when we see name changes in the Bible, it's something that God initiates, right? From Abram to Abraham or Sarai to Sarah. We see that sometimes. But in this case, things were so difficult that she changes her name. Have you ever thought of changing your name just because it was so bad? Don't call me that. And so she says, "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me." Again, where does she point her finger? Right? It's very clearly, she points it at Jehovah. She said, "I went out full and I came back empty. Why do you call me Naomi when Jehovah has testified against me? And the Almighty has brought calamity on me." The Almighty has brought calamity on me. When you look at Naomi, you're looking at a story that's filled with grief and tragedy, at least in her perspective. And the thing is that sometimes that's part of how our lives are. Our lives aren't always picture perfect. Sometimes there are struggles and difficulties in our lives, and therefore I think it's really important that we look at, try to learn from Naomi about how we deal with things when we think God is against us and we feel very bitter about the things that has happened. So let's go back to that statement where she said, "I left full." Why did Naomi think Jehovah was against her? Now, the timing for the book of Ruth is somewhere during the period of the Judges. Period of the Judges is about a 400-year span. It's a really long time. And we're not sure exactly when it fits in there, but what was happening during the time of the Judges? The book of Judges uses this expression twice near the end of the book of Judges. It says, everyone did what was right in his own eyes. The book of Judges is about a time in the history of Israel where they don't have a king. The people are, I wanted to use the word fickle there, but that's not the right word, is it? They are unfaithful to God and chase after idols. And they go through a very clear cycle of following after God, choosing to follow idols, God sending a judge, them being oppressed, God sending someone to oppress them, them crying out to God, and God sending a judge or a deliverer who will release them from that. Naomi's living in a difficult time for the people of Israel. That's important to understand. And in those days, we're told in verse 1, there was a famine in Israel. Why did famines happen most of the time in the book of Judges? It was because of the idolatry of the people of Israel, and God was trying to bring them back to follow after Him. It's a judgment of God against their idolatry. Whenever I think of this, I'm always reminded of the way Amos describes this. Well, God says it's in the book of Amos. But in Amos, the 4th chapter, and in verse 6, God says to the people of Israel hundreds of years later, but the concept I think is still there. I gave you cleanness of teeth in all your cities and lack of bread in all your places, and yet you did not return to me. I sent you cleanness of teeth. You have clean teeth when you've not eaten anything, right? That's the idea. And lack of bread. I haven't given you any of that, and you still didn't return. So there's a pretty good chance that the time that Ruth and her husband and her 2 sons decide to leave Israel, it's because of this famine, which implies idolatry was bad in Israel. Do you think the idolatry in Israel was worse than the idolatry in Moab? The point is, idolatry is always bad, right? And so it's worse in Israel because they knew better. They had God's law. They had been given a covenant relationship with God. And so the idolatry but it was bad in Moab too. Moab is one of the places where they would sacrifice their children and burn their children. So it was bad. When they leave Bethlehem, it's Naomi, her husband, and her 2 sons. But understand, if there's famine in the land, what that means is that when she says, I left full, it's not meaning she had an abundance of food or even an abundance of things. What she's saying is, I had my family. That's what she cared about. I had my family. Does being full equate to being blessed? If you're an Israelite and promises had been given to you, it very much does. And you can see that just in part in how often women who did not have children saw the importance of having children. Remember Hannah from a couple of weeks ago, how she was tormented because she was childless, and she prayed to God and wept to God for the child, and asked Him to give her a son. It was a blessing to have that. So she says, when I left Bethlehem, I'm full. I've got my family around me. And maybe, I don't think that means everything was perfect in the family, but I mean, she had everyone there who was with them. But 10 years later, when she comes back, she says, I'm empty. The Bible very specifically in the story of Ruth says it's been 10 years. And what happens to Naomi in those 10 years? So In those 10 years, there's been famine in Israel, and they have to leave home. We kind of covered that. They end up choosing to go to Moab, which had to be a difficult choice in and of itself, in my opinion. And while they're in Moab, her husband dies. So she's left as a widow. And then her sons marry Moabite women. Sometimes people are picky about who their kids marry. I don't know how I knew I was going to do that at some point in the lesson. I don't know how Naomi felt about her sons marrying non-Israelite girls. But there is kind of a cliche about it, isn't there? And a lot of people would say, well, they were wrong to do that. They were in that situation. How did... my sons are married, but they're to Moabite women. And then both her sons die. And there's even an implication, because it's not even really an implication. I mean, it's just pretty much there. There have been no children at this point. The children, they were never mentioned in that. So she says, I went away empty. So how does Naomi see herself and her life? She's a widow, and she feels alone, doesn't she? And there's a part of you that might say, yeah, but she has her daughter-in-laws. But when she decides and she hears that God has given food in Israel and she decides to go back, what does she try to do? She says to her daughter-in-laws, don't come with me. Go, return each of you to your mother's house. Go back home. What is she doing? She's kind of pushing them away, isn't she? They wept. They weep at that point, and they cry out and said, no, we're going to go with you. And she says to them again, turn back. Why would you go with me? That's the voice of someone who's alone. Someone who is, like Naomi, bitter about how things have turned out. Why would you go with me? I can't have any more sons. Even if that was a possibility, would you wait for them to get married? No, she says, my daughters. By the way, she doesn't say my daughter-in-laws. She says my daughters, and that's beautiful. My daughters, it's bitter for me that God's hand has gone out against me. Why will you go with me? What do you hear? Do you hear that sense of aloneness? And she lifts up her voice, and they weep together. And Orpah says goodbye. She goes home. And Ruth is still there. In fact, it says Ruth clung to her, which is beautiful. It's one of the reasons we like talking about Ruth. And what does Naomi say now? See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after her. You go too. She keeps pushing and pushing and pushing. 3 times. She's alone. And that's where we get that beautiful statement in the first chapter where Ruth refuses to leave. And we're going to come back to that in a moment, because she tells her, your people will be my people and your God, my God. You're familiar with that, right? It's a beautiful commitment that she has. And then after that beautiful thing that Ruth says, like I said, we'll get back to it, don't worry. After that beautiful thing that Ruth says, what does Naomi say? It says, when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. I guess, she stopped pushing them away, but she didn't say, well, great, let's go. There's no, let's be all happy about it. Nope, she just said no more. Let's go on to that. When you read this part of Naomi's story in the first chapter, do you have compassion with Naomi? Do you struggle with her bitterness? I believe we can both have that compassion, but I believe a lot of us struggle with that bitterness. And I want to help with that today. I want us to think about that today. She's grieving from the loss of her husband, grieving for the loss of her sons, and that grief is both very real and it's a very powerful thing to face that kind of grief. And no grandchildren. Their time in Moab, as far as Naomi is concerned, has been a complete failure, hasn't it? 10 years, and it's all gone bad. Can someone be bitter and still have faith in Jehovah? And remember, she pointed her finger very pointedly about Jehovah and the Almighty and who had done that to her. And part of the reason that we have that is we tend to think that Jehovah is going to bless us. We expect God's going to bless us. And if we feel that we aren't blessed by God the way that we should be, where do we start looking? It's easy to blame God then, right, if he doesn't bless us. And even if we don't become to the point where we blame God, we could kind of hold it in. And that's where the bitterness comes in. The bitterness where we're kind of angry with God, and we don't say it out loud, but it's just kind of in there. My expectations were these things, but they never happened. So we get angry and we kind of accuse God, and the bitterness just builds up. Unrealized expectations are one of the most harmful things in any relationship. In your marriage, in your relationship with your children, holding on to those things that I've never said them to you, but you don't do them back, oof, that's begging for a fight. Unrealized expectations often lead to frustration and disappointment, eventually anger, but definitely bitterness. All wrapped up into that. What did Naomi and her family expect when they went to Moab? They expected to find a food, place for them to live until they could come back to Israel. I've heard many people condemn Elimelech. Is it Elimelech? Did I say his name right? We gotta find it. Yeah. Elimelech. That's how I'm going to say his name. Many people condemn them for leaving. They said, well, if an Israelite, if you truly have faith, you would just stay in Israel. But maybe the famine was so bad, they said, look, we still believe in God, but we want food. And you know what? Abraham went to Egypt for food, and his sons went to Egypt for food. There are times when the right thing to do is to leave, maybe because the people are bad. So I'm not going to look at Naomi and Elimelech and say they were bad for what they did. We don't have enough information for that. But what we do know is it didn't go the way they expected. There is great danger in being bitter. Please don't get me wrong when I'm talking about this bitterness. In Hebrews, the 12th chapter, and in verse 15, the writer of the Hebrew letter warns us against this. Sorry, I'm going the wrong way on my slides. Hebrews 12 and in verse 15. We're going to come back to the context of this in a moment, so you might want to stick a finger there or something. But the writer says, see to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God. And of course, that's really what the book of Hebrews is about, isn't it? See to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God. They were wanting things, and then things got hard. See to it that no one fails to see the grace of God. That no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and by it many become defiled. I like the way it speaks of that. The root of bitterness. Where does bitterness take root? Isn't it in our hearts first? When we start thinking these things, where we have the expectations and things aren't going the way we think, and at least in our hearts, at least we start there, that there's this root of bitterness. And what does the writer say about what happens when that root gets in there? And it causes trouble. Oh, by the way, it springs up. That's vivid. isn't it? Starts in the roots, but boom, all of a sudden it's there, and it causes trouble. You have to be careful. We have to be careful about bitterness. It's always there, and it's a problem for all of us. In fact, in Ephesians, the 4th chapter, one of the characteristics that we're told that we need to get rid of is bitterness. Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you, along with all malice. And you notice what bitterness is mixed in with? Wrath and anger and clamor and slander and hatred. Bitterness is that bad. And God says, you've got to put it away from you. That doesn't mean we're not going to struggle with it. I understand I'm supposed to put away anger, but sometimes I still struggle with being angry. What he's warning us of here is this great danger that bitterness can have in our hearts. And if we're not careful, we'd let it go. So we read all the passages where we hear Naomi's bitterness. I want to ask you this question. Is Naomi's bitterness a complaint, or is it a lament? And your first response is, what do you mean by those? What do you mean by those two things? What do you mean by a complaint or a lament? But honestly, isn't it hard to tell? Isn't it hard to tell whether this is a lament or a complaint? Seeing it as a complaint is easy. I think it's the easiest way. And if it is a complaint, the consequences are dire. And that's going to be true for us also. Because built into a complaint are resentment and dissatisfaction with our God. Someone who is complaining, and this is true in general of complaining, will talk negatively about Jehovah, and almost only from one perspective. But a lament, boy, it's harder to see it as a lament, isn't it? It's just easy to hear everything that she said as a complaint, but listen to it as a lament. And I think based on, as we'll see a little bit later in the lesson, statements about her faith and her faith in the Almighty, this is probably more accurately a lament, not a complaint. Understand, I'm not saying that there's not a danger here still. She's bitter, she knows she's bitter, and she has no problem telling everyone she's bitter. And the scriptures say that's a dangerous thing. Trouble can spring from that. A lament recognizes what happens. It feels free to express that grief, the sadness, and the pain. But lament talks to Jehovah about what's happening and seeks understanding. The complaint is to others, lament looks to God. What was she doing? I think she was a lament. To me, we'll see in a moment that faith. But this brings up a really important question. How do we help people who are bitter like this? Sometimes we think the best thing to do is to pump them up with positivity, right? I tried to say that as motivational speaker-ish as I could. I don't obviously have that knack. Walk on the sunny side of the street, right? Count your blessings. There's a time to grieve, and you've had plenty of time to do that. You need to move on. We sure miss the old you. But often those kind of statements fail because those who are bitter are struggling with seeing any blessings. What they see is the downpour. What they see is the darkness. To tell them to walk on the sunny side of the street, you haven't helped them get there. They don't know where it's at. What blessings they do know don't compare to the struggles and the sorrow and the grief that they're facing. So there may be times when that's the right thing. I'm not going to say it's not true. But I'm also letting you know that sometimes it's exactly the wrong thing. It's not going to help them. Ruth really helps us with this. Ruth 1, and then verse 16. And this is when Naomi's been saying, why would you go with me? Why would you follow after me? Why would you do those things? And listen to what Ruth says. Ruth 1 and verse 16. But Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or return from following you. So often we don't even notice the first part of that statement, but it's answering exactly with what Naomi was trying to do. Push away, push away, push away. And Ruth says, don't urge me to leave you or return from following you. For where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May Jehovah do more so to me May Jehovah do so to me and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. We often use this as a romantic sentiment in weddings, and I'm not going to say it's wrong, but it's not the context. So we miss what Ruth is doing here because we turn it into a wedding message. Sometimes we speak of it as Ruth's loyalty or devotion or her steadfast love. And that's all true also. I'm not going to say that that's wrong. But even more basic, Ruth says to Naomi, I'm not going to leave you alone. You feel bitter and you feel left alone and you feel forsaken by God and your family's been destroyed. You feel alone and you feel abandoned. I'm going to be here no matter what. And that's how she helped a person who was bitter, is to say, you're not alone. You've got someone. And that's how you can help people who are bitter. Go back to Hebrews, the 12th chapter, that we had read that passage that said, don't let the root of bitterness spring up. And a few verses above that, we can read this. Hebrews 12 and beginning in verse 12. The writer says, therefore lift up your drooping hands and strengthen your weak knees and make straight paths for your feet, so that what is lame may not be put out of joint, but rather be healed. He's talking in context of a congregation or a group of people here, and what does he tell them to do for each other? When you see someone with their hands drooping, lift them up. Strengthen the weak knees so they can continue going. Provide a straight path to help them. And the reason you do all of these things is to heal. What is our tendency to do with someone who's bitter? What is our tendency to do with someone who says, I'm alone and I want to be left alone, and they push you away? Well, often we grant them that exact wish. But this is what Ruth was doing for Naomi. She saw someone who was down and she lifted her up. And that's what you do to help someone who's bitter. So, the last part of the story, we're skipping a lot here because a lot of the story involves Ruth and Boaz and how they get together. And in the end, of course, a child comes through them. But as we go through the story, I want you to note with me indications of Naomi's faith. I'll try to go through this quickly. When she's telling her daughters to leave, Ruth 1:8, she says, may Jehovah deal kindly with you. Is that faith in God? Okay, she's still bitter. I mean, that's right before she said, but may Jehovah, that's still faith in God, isn't it? And she says to them again later, in the next verse, Jehovah grant that you find rest, each of you, in the house of her husband. Not only is she showing faith there, but she's saying Jehovah's going to help you, which is amazing because these are Moabite women. Still faith? Verse 11, when she tells her daughters-in-law to turn back. And she says, have I sons in my womb that may become your own husbands? We miss that one because that's part of the marriage situation. But that's her saying, I'm going to keep following God's law. That's still faith. In verse 20, chapter 2, verse 20, when Boaz has been so nice to Ruth and she comes back in after a whole day of working, Ruth comes home, tells her what happened with Boaz, and Ruth chapter 2 verse 20 says, may he, talking about Boaz, may he be blessed by Jehovah, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. I think she means by the dead, her husband. Do you hear faith in that statement also? May Jehovah bless him. That's faith. She also says to Naomi, this man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers. Again, referring to following the law. Naomi was bitter, but she hadn't abandoned God. That's what all of those little statements tell me. For all the statements about being bitter, you can find these statements of faith. And we have to keep those together in our minds, that those are there. She blessed others through them. She saw Jehovah's kindness. She kept following after his laws. How do I have faith in Jehovah in the midst of various struggles? How can I be like Naomi in this case, where in the heart there's these struggles? How do I cope with the emotions that the struggles engender in my life? And I'm going to turn us to the book of Lamentations for this. Go to Jeremiah and go one book over. That's where you find the little book of Lamentations, the 3rd chapter. And we're going to look beginning in verse 19. The context of the book of Lamentations, by the way, this is after the fall of Jerusalem. It's been destroyed by the Babylonians. The Israelites have been taken captive into Babylon. And Jeremiah is mourning for the loss of his city and his people. I know it's not the exact same situation, but the concepts here are what we can learn from. Lamentations, the 3rd chapter, beginning in verse 19. Jeremiah says, remember my affliction and my wanderings, the wormwood and the gall. My soul continually remembers it and is bowed down within me. But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of Jehovah never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Jehovah is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in him. Jehovah is good to those who wait for him and to the soul who seeks him. It is good that one should wait quietly for the salvation of Jehovah. What do you see there? Where's the hope in this? He says, I remember affliction, wandering, bitterness, and gall. No, wormwood. Wormwood, which was bitter, by the way. That's why I did that in my head. But anyway, what is he saying? Jeremiah is saying, as Jerusalem was falling, as I saw the decline, it just tore him up inside. He remembers all of those things. And he says, my soul's bowed down within me. You'll see that statement, something like it, several times in the Psalms, where David says, my heart fails me. And what does he look to? I call this to mind, and therefore I have hope. And hope is the answer in some extent to bitterness. Which is kind of ironic, because at the beginning I was talking about unrealized expectations, and now I'm pushing hope again. But hope that you can find that's real. And what does he point to? In verse 22. The steadfast love of Jehovah, his mercies, and his faithfulness. And he says about the steadfast love, how long does it last? It is never ceasing. The mercies don't come to an end, and his faithfulness is fresh every morning. And I want you to go back to the story of Ruth And think about that morning when Ruth said, I'm going to go out and glean. Are you okay with that, Naomi? And Naomi says, yeah, go do that. And by the end of that story, where she's going out to glean because she's poverty-stricken, she comes home and she's met the man that's going to be her husband. I don't think any of them expected that day that they would not just come back home with food. I think they were just hoping for food. But then you see the steadfast love and the mercies and the faithfulness of God. And so in verse 24 says, therefore I'm going to hope in him. And what does he tell us to do in verse 25 and 26? Wait for him, seek him, and the really hard one is wait quietly. Wait quietly. That's a hard one. What does Naomi teach us? Sometimes our lives are very difficult, and we're going to find times where we grieve the death of those that we love, whether it's our spouse or our children, other members of our family. Sometimes it's about health and financial troubles. Sometimes they're very difficult, and we must beware that bitterness doesn't take root in our heart and turn us away from God. Don't let that happen with the bitterness. There are going to be times when you think Jehovah is against you. But we always have to see the reality of our situation, and we can talk with God about it. It's okay to go to God with our laments. It's okay when our prayers are prayers that are expressing how we feel like we are alone and abandoned, not just by those who are of the world, but sometimes we feel that way from God. And when we're hurting and when we're grieving, we cry out to him, just like Jeremiah did in Lamentations. And like Ruth did for Naomi, you're not alone. You have Jehovah. Hebrews tells us you have your brethren to lift up the drooping arms. And we have that example of Ruth. Doesn't matter. Where you go, I will go. I will never leave you or forsake you. When you're bitter, keep your faith. It's not a cure, but learn to look in hope. Trust in God because of who he is, and wait for him. And hope comes in the morning. And that's where the book of Ruth ends, isn't it? With hope. Because Naomi is the great-great-grandmother of David. And through David comes Jesus. And through Jesus, we all have hope. This is the story of a bitter woman who had faith in God, and through her family, one day came the Messiah. And you can have hope. Sin separates us from God. Jesus is the way to the Father. Do you believe? You can have hope in that. We want to offer the invitation for anyone here. If you need our prayers or help, if you want to use this moment because you believe to be baptized, please come forward as we stand and sing. Face to face.